ladies and gentlemen. There is an old trick, played time and again, that keeps most of us from seeing what is right before our eyes. It is the idea that evil is always elsewhere, somewhere out there, lurking in dark alleys or distant governments, but never near enough to touch our own lives. It is a useful deception because it makes us feel safe. But if the world has taught us anything, it is this: evil is not just at the edges of society, it is woven into the very fabric of our lives. This I do not mean that we live among monsters with horns and sulphurous breath, though, if such a thing existed, we might find them more trustworthy than the tempters we actually face. No, the demons in our midst are subtler, and they are quite good at their work. They do not appear in nightmares, but in friendly conversations. They do not frighten, they flatter. They do not rage. They may be a friend who encourages your small betrayals, a colleague who turns every discussion towards cynicism, or a voice within yourself that insists virtue is too difficult and compromise is always reasonable. Demons do not need to shout to be heard, they only need to persuade. And yet, the most dangerous of them all, the one whose influence is strongest, is not the friend or the enemy, not the politician or the stranger. It is the demon we allow to sit in the quiet chambers of our own hearts. It is the one that assures us that our sins are harmless, that our selfishness is natural, that we are always justified. The great battle of this world is not one of swords or armies, but of persuasion. It is not fought on the streets, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. The most successful demons do not ask you to commit great evil all at once. They merely nudge you, ever so slightly, toward a path where goodness seems impractical and truth seems inconvenient. So I ask you, who in your life is leading you away from what is right? What voice is steering you toward cowardice, dishonesty, or despair? And above all, are you sure, absolutely sure, that it is not your own? The greatest trick of the enemy is not in forcing you to do evil, but in convincing you that evil does not exist. And once that happens, the battle is already lost. Evil is not distant, but present in everyday life, woven into the fabric of our daily interactions, choices, and even our thoughts. It does not reside only in the pages of history books, nor is it confined to the dark corners of war-torn lands or criminal underworlds. It is here, around us, often so subtle that we fail to recognize it. We have trained ourselves to look for evil in its most dramatic forms: tyrants, murderers, and catastrophes, forgetting that its most effective work happens in the quiet, ordinary moments of life. We imagine evil as something external, something that happens out there in the world among other people. We turn on the news and shake our heads at corruption and violence, comfortably distancing ourselves from the reality that these same forces operate in our own hearts and homes. The person who slowly allows bitterness to take root, the one who delights in gossiping about others, the small dishonesty we excuse because everyone does it. These are not grand betrayals, yet they are the soil in which greater evils grow. What we tolerate in ourselves, we empower in society. Most people, if asked, would say they are good. We rarely think of ourselves as part of the problem. We tell ourselves that we are nothing like the villains of history or the criminals on the evening news. But evil does not need us to be monsters. It only needs us to be indifferent. It needs us to look the other way when truth is inconvenient, to remain silent when justice requires a voice. It thrives in our excuses and justifications, in our ability to redefine right and wrong based on what suits us best. It does not come crashing through the door with the sound of thunder, it seeps in through the cracks. It is the slow erosion of integrity, the gentle whisper that tells us it's all right to bend the truth, to put our own comfort above someone else's suffering, to ignore the weight of our responsibilities. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to do great harm. Instead, they take small steps, each one slightly easier than the last, until one day they find themselves in a place they never intended to be. The greatest tool of evil is its ability to make us unaware of its presence. If it were always obvious, we would resist, but when it disguises itself as practicality, as harmless amusement, or as mere human weakness, we fail to see it for what it is. We do not recognize that the same greed that destroys nations also poisons the heart of a single man. The same pride that leads rulers to oppress people also ruins friendships and marriages. The same cruelty that has shaped the worst moments in history is at work in every small act of unkindness, every choice to put the self above the good. If evil were distant, if it belonged only to the past or to others, we would have little reason to guard against it. But it is here, in the choices we make, in the words we speak, and in the things we choose to ignore. Demons do not appear as monsters, but as persuasive voices in our minds and relationships. If they came to us as horned creatures with blazing eyes, we would recognize them at once and recoil in terror. But they do not need to frighten us into submission, they only need to convince us. Their power lies not in their strength, but in their ability to persuade, to manipulate, to make us believe that what is wrong is right and what is harmful is harmless. They do not force us to act against our will, they make us want to. Most people assume that if they were ever confronted with evil, they would resist it. They imagine dramatic moments where they would take a stand, where the difference between good and bad would be so clear that choosing the right path would require no effort. But the most dangerous temptations do not announce themselves with trumpets and warnings. They come quietly, dressed as reasonable thoughts, disguised as the voices of friends, as the gentle rationalizations we whisper to ourselves. The voices do not tell us to abandon goodness all at once. Instead, they suggest a small compromise, an ever so slight deviation from what we know to be true. They tell us that honesty is good, but that in this one case, a small lie would be harmless. They tell us that kindness is noble, but that this person does not deserve it. They assure us that morality is important, but that we are too tired, too busy, too burdened to care today. Sometimes these voices come from within, from the part of us that would rather choose comfort over courage. Other times they come from those around us, friends, mentors, even loved ones, who, knowingly or unknowingly, lead us away from what is right. They tell us what we want to hear, that we are justified in our anger, that we deserve whatever we desire, that we need not concern ourselves with matters of conscience when the world is so full of those who do worse. It is easy to accept these ideas because they make life easier, but every easy path that leads away from truth is one step further into darkness. The most skilled deceivers know that they do not need to shout or demand. They only need to plant a thought. A single suggestion, carefully placed, can be more powerful than any threat. A question that makes us doubt, a joke that makes sin seem amusing, a gentle mockery of virtue. All these things can shift the heart in ways that go unnoticed at first. A demon does not have to frighten a man to control him. It only needs to convince him that it is his own voice he is listening to. And so the battle is not fought in great moments of decision, but in the small, everyday choices we make when we believe no one is watching. It is not a war of weapons, but a war of words, a contest of persuasion. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who threatens us, but the one who makes us believe there is no enemy at all. The most dangerous demon is often the one within ourselves, hiding in the shadow of our own desires, fears, and insecurities. It does not need to appear as a monstrous figure. It does not need to take on a foreign shape to be recognized as evil. The demon that lives inside us is much more subtle. It is the voice that whispers in our own minds, encouraging us to make compromises, to justify wrong actions, and to believe that our desires are always righteous. It convinces us that the discomfort of self-restraint is a sign of weakness, that the temptation to indulge is merely a natural response to a harsh world, and in doing so it leads us astray without ever seeming like an enemy. When we look at the evils of the world, it is easy to blame them on external forces, on others, on circumstances, on society. We think, I would never do that, and in that moment we distance ourselves from the real danger. We fail to see that the seeds of these same evils can be found within us, growing in the fertile soil of our pride, our ambition, our self-justification. It is not that we are all capable of great atrocities, but that we are all capable of small betrayals of our better selves. Each time we allow the inner demon to speak louder than our conscience, we take another step toward becoming someone we never imagined we would be. This demon within us is not something we invite willingly, but it thrives in the spaces where we are most vulnerable. It feeds on our doubts, on our need for approval, and on our desire to avoid pain or discomfort. When we feel insecure, it suggests that we deserve more than we have. When we face challenges, it tells us that shortcuts are acceptable. When we are hurt, it encourages us to seek revenge or to hold grudges. The voice within us becomes so familiar, so constant, that we fail to question its authority. It is easier to follow its guidance than to confront the uncomfortable truths it hides from us. The most dangerous demon within us is not the one that seeks to destroy us outright, but the one that lulls us into complacency. It does not demand immediate surrender. It works gradually, making small demands until we are no longer aware of the power it has over us. It teaches us to minimize our faults, to explain away our flaws, and to see ourselves as blameless in the face of our wrongs. It suggests that we are the victims in every scenario, that others are the cause of our failings, and that there is no need for true self-reflection. In truth, this internal demon is the hardest to recognize because it wears the mask of our own identity. It convinces us that its voice is our voice, that its desires are our desires. It persuades us to listen to the parts of ourselves we are most comfortable with, the parts that want to take the easy route, to avoid the hard work of change, to settle for mediocrity. And so we remain trapped, unaware that the very thoughts that guide us toward compromise are the chains that keep us from being the people we are meant to be. The greatest danger lies not in facing external demons, but in confronting the one that lives within us. It is only when we recognize its voice, when we understand the depth of its influence, that we can begin to fight back. But the struggle is lifelong and the battle is never fully won because the demon does not die. It only retreats into silence, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next opportunity to speak. And so we must remain vigilant, always aware that the most dangerous enemy is the one that lives inside us. Temptation works gradually, leading us away from goodness step by step. It does not strike suddenly, as we might imagine, in one grand, decisive moment. Instead, it operates like a slow current, imperceptibly pulling us away from solid ground. In its early stages, it seems harmless, almost trivial, yet with every small concession, the path becomes less clear, and the distance from virtue grows ever greater. And then it all ever grows lower, and the distance from virtue grows ever greater. What begins as a simple suggestion, a minor indulgence, or a slight bending of the rules eventually leads us far from where we started, without our even realizing how far we have drifted. When faced with temptation, we often believe that we can control it, that we can indulge just a little and then stop. But the power of temptation lies in its incremental nature. It does not demand total surrender all at once. It begins with a single thought, an invitation to justify a small action that feels insignificant, a harmless indulgence that feels natural. But once we give in, the next step seems easier, and then the next. Each time we yield, we are pulled further, not just in our actions, but in our mindset. Until what once seemed like a clear line between right and wrong blurs into a gray area, where the distinction is no longer so obvious. At first, the compromises are small, an untruth told to protect our pride, a moment of laziness when we could have been productive, a slight harm done to another when we could have chosen kindness. We tell ourselves that these actions don't matter, that they are too small to make a difference, that everyone does them. But what we fail to recognize is that each of these small steps chips away at our moral foundation. We tell ourselves that we can always return to goodness later, but the further we stray, the harder it becomes to find our way back. The more we give in to temptation, the more it rewires our thinking, making it harder to recognize the harm we are causing, both to others and to ourselves. The gradual nature of temptation is what makes it so dangerous. It does not hit us with a thunderous force, forcing us to choose between good and evil in a single moment of clarity. Instead, it whispers softly, making its way into our thoughts and emotions, suggesting that what is wrong is really not so bad, that what is selfish is justified, that what is lazy is acceptable. By the time we realize how far we've gone, the habit of yielding has been established, and it takes far more effort to resist than it would have if we had stopped at the first step. In this way, temptation leads us away from goodness, not in a great leap, but in 1,000 small steps, each one seeming insignificant on its own, but adding up to a journey that takes us further from who we truly want to be. It is easy to think we are immune, that we are strong enough to resist the larger evils, but it is the slow and subtle nature of temptation that lulls us into a false sense of security. We may not fall all at once, but with every small compromise we move further from the goodness we once knew. The battle against evil is one of persuasion, not force. In the world we inhabit, we often expect that evil will confront us with weapons, with aggression, and with overwhelming force. We imagine it as something external, something that can be fought with strength and courage. Yet the true nature of evil is far more insidious. It does not need to overpower us with violence or terror. It only needs to persuade us, to convince us that what is wrong is actually right, that what is harmful is somehow justified. Evil's greatest weapon is not its ability to overpower, but its ability to alter the way we think, the way we see the world, and the way we define good and bad. Evil works through suggestion, through small nudges that go unnoticed, through whispers that convince us that certain actions are acceptable, even necessary. It does not demand our immediate surrender, but rather it patiently waits for us to weaken, to doubt, and to make choices that pull us further away from what is good. The battle is not one of sheer willpower or physical strength. It is one of mental and moral persuasion. The enemy does not need to force us to do wrong. It simply needs us to believe that there is nothing wrong with what we are doing. In this battle, the enemy often disguises itself as something harmless or even desirable. It is not a monster we fight, but an idea, a worldview, a shift in perspective. It does not confront us with open hostility. Instead, it presents itself as a friend, offering shortcuts, tempting us with ease, and promising that we can avoid the discomfort of doing what is right. It presents lies as truth, making them seem more convincing with each repetition, each subtle shift in our thinking. The more we hear these lies, the more they begin to feel like reality. This is why the battle is so much more difficult than we might imagine. It is not a war that can be won by sheer force of arms or by overwhelming power. It is a war of words, a struggle for control over how we think, what we value, and how we understand the world. The smallest lie, if repeated often enough, can begin to feel like a truth. The simplest temptation, if indulged even once, can lead us to believe that it is harmless, that it is acceptable, that it is even necessary. Inevitable, and once we are convinced, the battle is already lost. The battle against evil is not one fought on the battlefield, but in the quiet recesses of our minds, in the private conversations we have with ourselves, and in the subtle shifts in our thinking that go unnoticed until they have already changed us. We must be vigilant, because evil does not announce itself with a flag or a loud cry. It comes in whispers, in thoughts that seem innocent or insignificant, but which, over time, erode our understanding of what is right. The most dangerous forms of evil are not those that force us into submission, but those that quietly, gently persuade us to accept them as part of our lives. It is in the small compromises, the quiet justifications, and the gentle invitations to stray from the path that evil is most dangerous. The power lies not in our ability to fight back with force, but in our ability to recognize persuasion when it is happening. We must not only resist the great evils, but also the small, subtle temptations that shift our thinking, that cloud our judgment, and that lead us away from what is true and good. The greatest deception is believing that evil does not exist. It is a subtle lie that many of us fall victim to, often without even realizing it. In a world where we have come to rely on rationality, science, and progress, we find it increasingly difficult to acknowledge the presence of something as intangible and uncomfortable as evil. We prefer to see the world as a place where everything can be explained, where every action has a logical cause, and where every problem has a practical solution. Evil, we believe, is a thing of the past, something that belongs to ancient myths, to the distant corners of history, or to the minds of those who are truly deranged. But in doing so, we make a grave error, for to believe that evil does not exist is to open ourselves up to its quiet infiltration, to allow it to take root in our hearts and in our society without ever recognizing it for what it truly is. The deception is most powerful because it masquerades as something noble. It tells us that we are above such primitive notions, that we have outgrown the concept of evil, that we can dismiss it as superstition or as a relic of a less enlightened age. This belief lulls us into a false sense of security, making us think that we no longer need to be vigilant, no longer need to watch for the subtle ways that evil creeps into our lives. If we believe that evil does not exist, we stop questioning the small injustices we encounter each day, the petty betrayals, the lies that seem harmless, and the moments when we compromise our values. We no longer recognize the dangers that come from a gradual erosion of what is good. The truth is that evil does not announce itself with grand gestures. It comes quietly, slowly, and almost imperceptibly. It does not always take the form of a villain with malicious intent. Often it wears a mask of convenience, of justification, of rationalization. It appears in the voice that tells us to be selfish, to take what we want, to disregard the needs of others because our own desires are more important. It speaks in the whisper that convinces us that a small wrong is harmless, that what is done in the dark is not truly seen, and that the end justifies the means. When we do not believe in the existence of evil, we become blind to these whispers, and we fall into a dangerous complacency, accepting what we should resist and ignoring what we should fight against. By dismissing evil, we also dismiss the need for true self-reflection. We stop examining our own actions and motivations, believing that as long as we are not causing harm on a grand scale, we are safe. We fail to see how small acts of selfishness and dishonesty, unchecked, build the foundation for larger wrongs. We fail to notice how a lack of compassion, a failure to stand for what is right, and a passive acceptance of injustice contribute to the broader corruption of society. If we do not believe in evil, we are less likely to recognize it in our own lives, and we are less likely to have the strength to confront it. The greatest deception is not in the grandeur of evil schemes, but in the subtlety of its denial. It convinces us that we are immune, that it is something for others to deal with, that we are safe as long as we keep our own hands clean. But in truth, the more we convince ourselves that evil does not exist, the more vulnerable we become to its quiet influence. And by the time we realize it, it may have already woven itself so deeply into our hearts and into the fabric of our world that we no longer recognize it at all.